Take charge of the situation. First, make a full assessment. Events suggest, and an examination confirms, a fracture of the thigh. There is intense pain, an obvious shortening of one leg, and an unnatural turn of the foot. Assemble the first aid team. Tell them to steady and support the casualty. Decisions must be made quickly and in a logical sequence. This is a serious situation. The first aid procedure is long. They are out of radio reach, and the casualty must be carried out. The first priority is to make the area safe. Sentries are posted to protect the first aid team. While the sergeant is giving his instructions, the first aid team slowly and steadily apply gentle but firm traction to return the limb to a position of natural alignment. Now they can remove the pack. Two of the patrol are instructed to carry on with the mission. Supplies are scarce. The sergeant has the presence of mind to collect the scarves. He can use them to immobilize the casualty. The snow is deep. Note that the team leader takes a few moments to pack down the snow. This will provide a more efficient working area. Cover the casualty. Throughout the procedure, maintain support at the shoulders and keep traction on the injured leg. The toboggan is unloaded. It contains useful materials and, of course, will be needed to transport the casualty. The casualty is measured for a splint. The first aid team must improvise supplies from available materials. The splint must be long enough to extend from the armpit to below the foot. Seven bandages are positioned by passing them under the casualty. Use broad bandages at the chest, pelvis, above and below the fracture, at the knees, and lower legs. Always use a narrow bandage at the ankles. Use clothing from the casualty's pack to pad between the legs. Place the splint against the injured leg. The splint should be well padded, especially under the armpit. Maintain tension as you move the good leg smoothly into position. Tie the bandages. First, tie the broad bandages at the chest and at the pelvis. Then tie a figure 8 bandage at the feet. Tie above and below the fracture, then at the knees and lower legs. Tie the knots against the splint. The femur or thigh bone is the largest bone in the human body. A fracture of the femur is one of the most serious of all fractures. Be aware that shock will always be present with this injury. The cold and prolonged exposure will aggravate the condition. Keep the casualty as warm as possible to help slow the progress of shock. Be sure that the head is covered. The casualty must be evacuated to medical aid as soon as he is immobilized. Be alert for any changes in his condition. This injury can be life-threatening. Now let's look at some other fractures, beginning with a closed fracture of the forearm. A fracture of the forearm is certainly uncomfortable, probably painful, but it is not life-threatening. Nevertheless, prompt first aid can help reduce pain and may prevent further damage.
What happened? I fell off the ladder. Well, you hurt anywhere?
Make an assessment. With a conscious casualty, ask him to describe what happened and where it hurts. Have the casualty steady and support his own arm.
You feel this? Yeah. How about your arm? Or just this arm, okay? Yeah, just this one.
Send for help.
Back to the office, phone the MR, tell them we need
Be thorough in your instructions. Specify your location, the nature of the injury, and request a report.
Okay, Chris, stay right here. I'll just go get my first aid kit inside the aircraft.
Get the first aid kit or assemble supplies, which you will need.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I'm back. Okay, we'll probably have to put
A fractured forearm can be readily recognized by swelling, discoloration, and an abnormal shape. The hand and wrist will be limp.
All I'm doing now is just put a padding. Okay.
You will have to put a padded splint on the injured arm. You can readily improvise from available materials. Even a sheaf of newspapers or magazines will do. A layer of padding will make the splint more comfortable. In this case, the first aider is using a shell dressing for padding. Secure the padding to the splint.
Okay, all I'm going to do now, I'll slide this underneath. Slowly.
Slide the splint under the injured arm.
And we'll have another one ready, okay? So very slowly, just let your slide it.
Ensure that the arm is always supported.
Okay. Okay.
It is useful to have both sides of the injury protected.
My hand is, you just put your hand there, okay? You ready? Yeah. Okay, go separate it. Okay, I will put another one on top one. Okay.
Using narrow bandages, secure the splint above and below the fracture. Tie the bandages off against the splint. Avoid any direct pressure on the fracture. Ensure that the fingernails are exposed so that the fingernails can be checked for any signs of loss of circulation. The first aid objective in the care of all fractures is to prevent further injury and to reduce pain. Apply an arm sling. Finish off at the elbow by twisting into a pigtail and tuck it in. A fracture of the forearm is not life-threatening, but the casualty must receive medical attention.
Use your other leg to help us.
An open fracture, when the bone protrudes, is of course more serious than a closed fracture. Dress the wound to control bleeding and to prevent contamination. Protect the protruding bone with a ring pad. There must never be direct pressure on an open fracture. Do not disturb the protruding bone. Have an assistant steadily but slowly return the limb to a position of natural alignment. The sole of the boot on the injured leg is hooked under the sole of the boot of the good leg. This will prevent the injured leg from shortening and thus will avoid friction on the bone ends. Turn your attention to splinting the leg. When materials for 2 splints are not available, the body splint method can be used. With this method, the good leg acts as a splint. Position 5 bandages. Use broad bandages at the thigh and the knee. Use narrow bandages above and below the fracture and at the ankle. Place padding between the legs. Tie the bandages. First tie the bandage at the thigh, then tie the bandage at the ankle, then at the knee, and finally above and below the fracture. Arrange for transportation to medical aid. This is a demonstration of the bandaging technique for a fracture of the upper arm. Help the casualty to position his arm across his chest. Support the injured limb in an arm sling. Tie off on the injured side. Slide padding in against the chest to cushion along the length of the upper arm and to maintain alignment of the limb. Apply an overbandage both above and below the site of the fracture to immobilize the upper arm against the chest. Tie off on the opposite side so that the widest part of the bandage provides support to the arm. The first aid objectives in the care of all fractures are to prevent further damage and to reduce pain. Steady and support the injured limb. Realign the limb if possible. On an open fracture, dress the wound to control bleeding and prevent further contamination. Immobilize with padding, splints, and bandages. Fractures of the arm should be supported in a sling. Transport the casualty to medical aid. Be aware that shock will usually be present with a fracture, particularly with a fracture of the large bones in the upper arm or thigh. Try to control shock. Most fractures are not life-threatening, but you can do much to prevent further damage by gentle handling and securely immobilizing the injured limb.